With the NHL trade deadline approaching this Friday, we have multiple reports and rumors on what the Islanders are going to be doing on this trade deadline to discuss on this episode of Islanders Digest. And let me tell you, no matter what the Islanders do decide to do, this is going to change everything for the franchise moving forward. Even if the Islanders decide to do what they've done in several years and do nothing, it will change everything for this franchise. In fact, that might be the most impactful thing they could do in the worst way. But before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Be one of our first 100 subscribers. If you're an Islander fan and you want more Islanders content, this is the channel for you. With that, let's get right into things. After last night's game, I really felt like that was the end of Brock Nelson's career with the Islanders, at least for now. They could always bring him back in free agency, but it felt like after that game, especially with him breaking up in the interview with Shannon Hogan, that it was his last game with the Islanders, and he knew it. And it was really heartfelt, impactful. You know, I love Brock Nelson as a player, but it really feels like at this point, everybody in the building seemed to know that it was Brock Nelson's game. They gave him a big cheer, standing ovation, and it just felt like a good ending, at least for now. And then I looked at the standings this morning, and I began to get nervous that Lou Lamoriello would not do the right thing. The Islanders are now only 3 points away from the Rangers in terms of making the playoffs. And the problem, we'll go back to the standings here, but the problem here is there's just so many teams to jump. But in my mind, I think it makes total sense for the Islanders to move on from Brock Nelson, a player who's going to be 34 years old, and really just try to build for the future because this team does not seem to have it. But it seems like Lou Lamoriello might not be on that page, according to some reports. Stefan Rossner here talked about Arthur Staple in his last column was writing about how the Islanders are still trying to re-sign Brock Nelson, which honestly surprises me. Like, I love Brock Nelson. I talked about in previous videos how re-signing Brock Nelson would not be the worst thing. I do think he's a valuable player that will age well, but at the same time, especially seeing how much of a seller's market this is, if this was a year where it was really hard to get top assets for a lot of players on the market, then I would think it was a completely different scenario. You have teams like the Lightning trading first-round picks, multiple first-round picks for Yanni Gourde and Oliver Bjorkstrand. If those players can get first-round picks, what can a player as impactful as Brock Nelson land on this market? And we're going to talk about that a little more as we get to some of the rumors. I am really excited to think about what this player can get for the Islanders. And here the Islanders are trying to retain him long-term when he really doesn't fit with the Islanders' plans, turning 34 years old. And note, this was the other day at the MSG game, so maybe losing to the Rangers kind of changed that thought process. But at the same time, I'm really worrying that Lou Lamoriello is going to decide to hold onto this player with the hopes of making a playoff push just because the Islanders beat the Winnipeg Jets last night. Even though they're 3 points out, there are so many teams ahead of the Islanders, and honestly, these teams are better than the Islanders. Now, if the Islanders are going to sign Brock Nelson, and I still think that is the wrong thing to do, they have to do it before Friday. As Staple mentions in this, as Roster mentions in this post, it is more than ideal for the Islanders to get it done before then if they intend to keep Brock Nelson. There was a quote from this MSG article that Arthur Staple wrote that Brock Nelson was saying, well, it doesn't necessarily have to get done before Friday's deadline. Like, that doesn't have to be the deadline for the contract. Completely disagree. Maybe for Nelson, it doesn't really have to happen before the trade deadline because it doesn't really matter, but the Islanders need to have their leverage. If the Islanders are going to re-sign Brock Nelson, it has to be right now. Quite frankly, it had to be yesterday. We were getting too close to the trade deadline. At this point, it really does not even make sense to be considering these conversations unless potentially Lou Lamoriello is trying to psych other teams out, make them really think that the Islanders do not want to get rid of Brock Nelson. And in a sense, I think they don't. But maybe to get other teams to give their maximum possible offers, because other than that, the Islanders cannot risk losing another player for nothing. We saw what happened with John Tavares. Like, they cannot do this again. Like, the amount of assets you can get for a player like Brock Nelson on the trade deadline, especially this season where it is such a seller's market, you have to trade Brock Nelson. I mean, let's go back to looking at the standings. Like, there is no reason for the Islanders to retain this player. I mean, sure, the Bruins are hurt. They can possibly jump back past them pretty easily. They got 2 games in hand against them. But after that, this playoff battle is going to be a bloodbath. And the Ottawa Senators are going to be really competitive. I think they have a pretty good roster this season. They have a lot of offense. The Montreal Canadiens are actually really starting to play well, and they're a team that has no pressure on their backs. The Detroit Red Wings are going to probably make trades to try to push to make the playoffs to end their playoff drought. Obviously, the Rangers are a team that has been underperforming this year, but if you look at their roster last season, this is a team that almost made it to Stanley Cup Finals. I'm so glad they didn't, but they came really close to making the Stanley Cup Finals. Now they add JT Miller. This is a team that we just seen is clearly better than the Islanders. They just beat them in 2 games, and it wasn't even close. It really didn't look that competitive. And if this whole playoff race is going to come down to the Islanders and the Rangers playing one last game, do you really think the Islanders are going to come out on top of that game, especially after seeing the first 3 games they played against the Rangers? It just doesn't make sense for the Islanders to push for this playoff spot. There are so many teams ahead of them, and yet we keep on seeing so many reports from Lou Lamoriello that seem like he is still interested in holding on to these players at the hope that they can have magic one last time. And I know it happened last year. I know it happened the year before that. But then what happens after that? This team is stagnant. They keep on making the playoffs and losing the first round to the Carolina Hurricanes. Maybe this year will be different because they won't play the Carolina Hurricanes in the first round. They'll just lose to the Washington Capitals, or even worse, the Toronto Maple Leafs instead. It doesn't make sense. Even if the team can make the playoffs, do you really think the Islanders can make such a push, especially in a year where so many teams genuinely feel like contenders, which is why we have such a seller's market, because there are so many teams that genuinely believe they can win the Stanley Cup this year. I mean, honestly, I wasn't even thinking about the Tampa Bay Lightning, but after they made their trade today, you got the Tampa Bay Lightning, you got the Florida Panthers, you got the Winnipeg Jets, you got so many really talented teams, and I don't think the Islanders are anywhere near that conversation. Even though they beat the Winnipeg Jets, they're not there. Now, the rumors we want to talk about are a little more encouraging, or at least for like what I want for the Islanders to do, because I really want them to sell. It seems like, according to the rumors, and keep this with a grain of salt because this is a rumor, the Islanders are having discussions about Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri, and they're expecting a lot in return if they are going to move these players. Now, again, take this source with a grain of salt, but I really think the reason I really want to talk about this is I really think this NHL top 6 forward, top prospect, and first round pick does make a lot of sense, at least for a player like Brock Nelson. Now, before you call me crazy, say this is way too much to ask for, if you think about what the Islanders got for Bo Horvat, now again, they did end up signing Bo Horvat, but when they traded for Bo Horvat, they really did not know for certain that they'd be able to re-sign him. And the package the Islanders gave back in return was Aatu Räty, the Islanders' top prospect at the time. Now, granted, he is not as good a prospect as other teams will likely be trading for Brock Nelson in return, but they gave up Anthony Beauvillier, a player who played some time as a top 6 forward for the Islanders, and they gave up a first-round pick. So really, this is a pretty reasonable asking price, at least for Brock Nelson. I think in terms of Kyle Palmieri, this asking price is absurd. I honestly don't believe Lou Lamoriello is asking for this. I assume maybe he's asking for a first round pick, and I could actually understand the argument from the Islanders that it doesn't make that much sense to trade Kyle Palmieri just for a second. Maybe you want to get a maximum return. It's the type of player that, especially if the Islanders are going to try to be competitive, it's a player that you rather have on your roster unless the other team really makes it worth your while, which if the Islanders are going to trade these players, I definitely want them to get maximum returns. Now, when it comes to the Brock Nelson trade, I definitely don't think they get an upper end top 6 forward. I think what they're more asking for, if this rumor is true, is they're more asking for a player who can play on their top 6, at least allow them to be competitive. Maybe a Anthony Duclair type player. I know Anthony Duclair is not having the best season, but like someone who's capable of doing what he can do when he's healthy. Something like that, where the Islanders, maybe their goal here is, even if they trade Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri, maybe their goal is to stay competitive. Maybe the Islanders get an offer they cannot refuse for Brock Nelson, but end up deciding to keep Kyle Palmieri to keep the roster competitive. That's probably not what I want to see happen. I think I really want to see both those players sold. They don't have to trade any other players if the value is not there. I don't want to sell off the entire team. But those 2 players, you don't want to lose them for nothing. I guess you could stomach losing Kyle Palmieri for nothing, especially if the offers are only around like 2 third-round picks or something like that. I'm not really going to get too upset if the Islanders pass up an offer like that and just decide to keep Palmieri to see what happens. Again, I do want this team to remain competitive down the road. I don't want the Islanders to just completely collapse and like tank for like the first overall pick, because a lot of times what you see happens with these teams that really collapse towards the end of the season is they really struggle the next season. I mean, you look at the Islanders, a lot of their issues they had at the end of last season really kind of started up again this season. It took them a while to get over those issues. I know they had injuries too, but really, the reason why we're looking at the Islanders at the outside looking in is because they had such a rough start to the season where they were blowing so many leads and losing so many games they should have won. Realistically, if the Islanders don't blow a record amount of leads in the first 20 games of this season, or at least it felt like a record amount of leads, they're probably in a playoff spot looking down at the Columbus Blue Jays, looking down at the New York Rangers. And so I definitely don't want the Islanders to completely fall apart, completely blow up the entire core, but you got to get assets for Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri. I know there's a lot of talk, and I've said in the past that I would be willing to sign Brock Nelson. I still like Brock Nelson. If the Islanders do trade Brock Nelson, I'm 100% open to trying to re-sign him, trying to sign him in free agency. I think it's definitely good that Lou Lamoriello is going to have a good relationship with this player. It just doesn't make sense for them to re-sign him right now, especially with teams offering so much for Brock Nelson. And honestly, I have a feeling they're probably offering a lot for Kyle Palmieri too, maybe even with them as a package. It just doesn't make sense not to trade these players. And I feel like everybody involved with this franchise, from the fans to the reporters to everyone, the roster is obviously going to want to try to make the playoffs, but everyone else looking in seems, even Shannon Hogan and Thomas Hickey, they're not going to say it, but they know that selling is probably the right thing for the Islanders to do. And yet, if we look again, it doesn't seem like Lou Lamoriello is committed that that's the right thing, and that is really scary. Again, I really hope he's just trying to keep the value up, just maybe trying to keep his cards close to his chest. Lou Lamoriello loves to say, when you got time, use it. But you know what? We've used the time. Brock Nelson is not going to have any more value. Like, this is it. Like, you got to pull the trigger. We'll see what the Islanders do. Let me know what you think is going to happen on this trade deadline. I think I know what everybody wants to happen, but what do you think is going to happen? I'm still really hoping the Islanders are going to sell, but I am not so sure anymore. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and let's go Islanders.